Assalamualaikum and hello. I'm SYAFI and I'll be presenting about verbal communication, specifically interpersonal and intrapersonal communication, alongside JASMIN, ZUBAIDAH, SHAHMI, and we. Throughout this presentation, we'll be presenting about a brief introduction on verbal communication, some objectives that hopefully you'll get by the end of the presentation. For interpersonal communication, we'll be presenting deeply about the definition, uses and examples, factors and elements, and its importance. While for interpersonal, we'll be talking about the definition, the types, aspects, examples, and uses as well, barriers that you might face when doing interpersonal communication, some pros and cons, and finally a conclusion. So a brief introduction would be that verbal communication involves the use of words or speech or auditory language to express emotions or thoughts or to exchange information. Verbal communication can be classified into four, which are small group communication, public communication, and our topic for today, which are interpersonal communication and interpersonal communication. So the objectives for this presentation would be for you to understand better on our topic again for today, interpersonal and interpersonal communication, to be able to differentiate between the two and to understand the types, the uses, as well as pros and cons for each, and the other points as well that are stated before. And now, JASMIN will present further about interpersonal communication.
Hi, so now I'm going to talk about interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication is a communication or interaction that takes place individually between two or groups of people, whether it's small or large, where exchange of thoughts, ideas, or information occurs. Interpersonal communication can be verbal, non-verbal, written, and visuals. These are some uses and examples of interpersonal communication. The uses are deliver and collect information, discussion, problem solving, smooth communication, and express of personal needs. And the examples are public speaking, meetings, phone calls, and interviews. Next, we will explain more further about interpersonal communication.
Thank you, Jasmine. I will now be talking about the factors and elements of interpersonal communication. There are 6 factors that go into interpersonal communication: the people involved, the message, noise, the context, the channel, and feedback. The people involved in interpersonal communication is the person that's giving the message and the person receiving the message. However, this doesn't mean that only one person talks and the other just listens. This interpersonal communication is a two-way process. Once one is done talking, the other can be talking next. The message is the message in interpersonal communication is given by the speaker and can include verbal and non-verbal forms of communication. Verbal communication is words spoken by the speaker, and non-verbal form of communication is facial expressions, body language, and tone of voice. Noise is the distortion of the message, which can result in the listener misinterpreting the message. Noise can consist of physical noise like background sounds, such as the noise of a vacuum cleaner or a jet flying overhead, and non-physical noise such as inappropriate body language or disinterest or inattention of the listener, and cultural differences between the speaker and the listener. The feedback is the response that's given by the receiver after the speaker is done talking to confirm that the message has been received. And feedback can be in the form of reactions, such as verbal statements or facial expressions, which show whether the receiver is comfortable with the message that is given. The context of the message is the environment which influences the communication, such as where the message is given. You wouldn't communicate about a very inappropriate subject in a public area, and the people who are involved. You wouldn't say something bad about your boss if he's standing right in front of you, if you're talking right to him. The last factor for interpersonal communication is the channel, which is the medium through which the communication takes place, such as over a telephone call or talking face-to-face. The importance of interpersonal communication is that it involves interdependent people, meaning that the communication usually occurs between people who are connected in some manner, such as I mentioned before, an employer talking with employees, a guy below talking to his boss, or parents talking to their children, such that interpersonal communication is in a way where the actions of one person involved in the communication will affect the other people involved. You can therefore say that interpersonal communication defines a relationship between the people who are talking with each other. And the form that this communication takes usually depends on the type of relation that the people involved have with each other. That is all from me. I will now pass to SHAHMI for his part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm gonna talk about intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication is basically communication between you and yourself. Unlike other communication, it does not include other people. It's just you and yourself. There's 3 types of interpersonal communication. One is the internal discourse, which happens inside the mind. Then there's the solo vocal communication, which is verbally executed. And there's also solo written communication, which is done in writing. And then there's 3 aspects of intrapersonal communication. First is the self-concept, which determines how a person sees himself or herself and how they act and behave around others. The second one is perception, which is how they interpret the world around them. And then there's expectation, which is predictions based on their self-concept and perception. The uses and examples of intrapersonal communication, mostly the solo vocal communication, because we're talking about vocal communication, verbal communication. First is that it helps to overcome negative feelings. For example, before a big interview, you're gonna talk to yourself in the mirror or something to gain confidence for the interview. Second is overcoming emotional distress. For example, you shouting alone, because interpersonal, to release your anger and fury. Other than that, it also aids learning. For example, when you're memorizing for an exam, you read it loudly so you can remember it easier. And finally, to clarify something that you've read. For example, when you're reading a book, there's one sentence that you don't really understand, and you read it loudly multiple times until you understand. That's all for my part. Next, I'll pass it to ZUBAIDAH.
Thank you to SHAHMI for explaining the previous part of our presentation. So I'm going to continue to the next part of our presentation, which is the intrapersonal communication barriers. So intrapersonal communication barriers referred to as the elements within the individual's own self which pose a hurdle from within the individual's communication, both in sending and receiving messages. So if communication barriers generally means the factor that contributes to less effective communication between two or more people, intrapersonal communication barriers simply means what are the limiting factors in achieving an effective communication within oneself. So whether or not what an individual see or perceive, which is the message, is delivered or processed effectively as expected. So next part is the category of the intrapersonal communication barriers. So according to research, there are different factors that might contribute to intrapersonal communication barriers. So all the factors are divided into categories. So intrapersonal communication barriers are the least discussed topic, but according to research, the first one being the first interpersonal communication barriers are in terms of physiological barriers. So physiological barriers in simpler ways means the medical situation of a person. So to understand physiological barriers situation, so given a situation in which a professor is giving a PowerPoint presentation to his or her students, so this one student might have poor eyesight, so she or he is having a difficult time to understand the lecture or the presentation. And then the person with good eyesight is able to get the message that is delivered by the professor. So physiological barriers may actually come from both the sender or the receiver. In this case, the professor is the sender. The professor might have speech problem, or he or she might talk in a very low volume, which may lead to students not hearing what the professor is explaining. So the sender, which is the professor, can be the barriers, and meanwhile for the receiver, as I previously mentioned, the students may have poor eyesight, or they're having hearing problem. These are the factors that falls under physiological barriers. So the next factors, which is the psychological barriers. So psychological barriers relates to the emotional character and mental limitations of human beings. So any psychological state that a person is in can affect your ability to send and receive a message. To understand this category, which is the psychological barriers vector, given, for example, when a person is upset, he or she is having a hard time to listening effectively to a message. So this is what it means in simpler ways of psychological barriers. So the next one is the perceptual barriers. Perceptual barriers simply means perception. So the way one perceives a subject or an event affects the way in which his or her thoughts about it. Perceptual barriers can be the significant source of barrier in communication. For example, given a situation, if one has had a negative experience with a friend, everything the friend does or say will be valued through this perception. So it all depends on the perception of a person and how those barriers exist. The fourth category, which is the attitudinal barriers. So attitudinal barriers are simply means the personal attitudes and opinions towards a situation. So for example, the sender is giving out his opinion about something, and then if the message is being received by the receiver, which matches with his or her opinions and belief, he or she would receive it openly and favorably. However, if the message does not match with his views or personal belief, he will not respond favorably. That is what it means in terms of personal attitudes. It's how he reacts to other opinions, other people's point of view or perspective. And then the next one is the emotional barriers. So emotional barriers is more often about the emotional state of an individual. So people base their encoding or transmitting of information on their personal experience, perceptions, and expectations. So often under stress or in an emotional state of mind, people are not able to see things as they otherwise would. So the emotional state of an individual is in will contribute to the barriers of communicating will contribute to the barriers of effective communication. Okay, so the next part is the pros and cons of the intrapersonal communication. So since intrapersonal communication or intrapersonal skills means the self-talk that we often have with ourselves, so the pros, which is the advantages of having this quality in a person, might be in terms of self-awareness. We are more aware of ourselves before other people, so we are always conscious of our actions and the things that we're going to do. So these are the pros of having this intrapersonal skills or intrapersonal communication. And then since an individual is aware of their actions and their personality, it helps them better in terms of managing their self. So they always alert what are the actions, what are the steps taken they need to do before anything else. Okay, and then self-confidence. From my understanding, having intrapersonal skills means that we are able to give ourselves the pep talk that we need at certain times. So this actually contributes in self-confidence of a person. Okay, and the next is, which is the cons or the disadvantages of intrapersonal communication. So having intrapersonal skills, a person might be too tense about or too conscious about him or herself. So this might actually lead to overthinking. So the person with these skills might overanalyze every single thing, and then it may lead to another situation, which is misconceptions of a situation. A person who are so tense about their thoughts might always jump to a conclusion from the misconceptions. So it leads to another problem, which is making the incorrect decision based on the misconceptions, and also misjudgment. So these are some of the cons that might come with intrapersonal skills or intrapersonal communications. So from here, it can be concluded that interpersonal skills or communications helps us to collaborate and work well with other people. It might be beneficial in terms of an organization, finding a job, and so on. Meanwhile, interpersonal communication is focusing more on ourselves, in which it might help us to recognize our strengths and weaknesses before anyone else. So both have their own differences and benefits if one tends to excel on any of these two skills of communications. However, it is important to note that intrapersonal forms the very basis of foundation of interpersonal. So, as quoted, it is what you think within you, consciously or unconsciously, that forms the basis of how you relate with another person. So, in another way, it means that to have a good interpersonal skills, you must have a balance of intrapersonal form. Because in order to understand other people, in order to communicate better with people, we have to start with ourselves first. So I guess that's all from me. Thank you for your time and thank you for listening.